All right, so we've been talking about some of these different agencies, organizations, public, private, that all sort of make up this big federal, state, local, private, corporate, nonprofit, individual landowners, this whole mosaic, this big patchwork quilt that we kind of drape across the map of the United States, continental United States, minor outlying territories, Alaska, Hawaii, the whole 9 yards. And in rolling all of these together, we can handle about anything and anybody as long as we get that activity and that reason for showing up at a national park or national recreation area or local dog walking park, whatever. If we can get the right people to the right place, then again, we can handle just about anything. And that's a big deal. That's important because we're talking about mass human use of these places. For example, back up one here. We saw this slide the other day, 450 million recreation visits per year throughout the Department of Interior. So the executive branch of the federal government, right? We have the executive, legislative, and judicial 3 branches of the federal government. In the executive branch, we have that sort of broken out across departments, and then each department has services. Okay, so executive branch of the government headed by the United States President, and the President appoints secretaries to each of those departments. So there's a Secretary of Defense, Secretary of Agriculture, all of this stuff, and the Department of Agriculture hosts or houses or aims or resources organizations like the United States Forest Service. Okay? Now, this all matters only because the Forest Service and the Park Service both run places that we use for forest and outdoor recreation, but the kinds of recreation available at a national forest or a national park can be very, very different. Now, there's definitely some overlap, like people like hiking kind of everywhere, and hiking's kind of compatible with almost every ecosystem. But other kinds of forest and outdoor recreation, like hunting, for example, not so much compatible with most national parks and how they need to be run in terms of their ecological needs and requirements. Okay? So, we have, out of this very long list of federal organizations, a couple of usual suspects. National Park Service, right? Top of the list, of course. And we also have United States Forest Service, and then some other maybe less well known, but absolutely as big, and in some cases better funded organizations. And this all matters mainly because at some point, in some way, some of you guys and gals are gonna need to get a job, right? And different agencies and organizations each have their own sort of funding cycles and hiring cycles and stuff like that. So, any of you guys and gals taking the professional development class? Okay, you guys have been talking about like different companies and organizations to work with before and stuff like that. All right, what has HEC been saying about the United States Forest Service so far this semester as an organization to work for?
We're mainly just talking about like USA jobs and going over all the different stuff in there.
Uh-huh.
And so we're kind of going over like really anything. We're talking about just getting like 1039s and stuff like that.
Yeah, perfect. All right, so about a week ago, the director of the Forest Service sent out a big memo, and he or she sends out a big memo like this basically every year that says something to the effect of, hey everybody, this is how much money we think we're going to have to spend on fighting wildfires and doing not so much fire suppression anymore, but wildland fire management. And that number is our entire budget. So we're going to throw everything we have, literally everything, at fighting wildfires out west, doing controlled burns, preventing next year's wildfires, and so forth. And if we have anything left over, at that point, we can do kind of all of everything else that the Forest Service is supposed to do. Question?
Is that like a big deal, or does that happen kind of like semi-regularly?
That's
Obviously it's a big deal, but I mean like...
Yeah. So in the field, this particular practice of kind of the chop and change tactic of, look, whatever our funding is from Congress this year, it's all going to fire. Hopefully we have something left over. They usually do. But sometimes it's just a really bad fire year, and you just don't know until you're through it, right? So, in that way, they have to not really hold back. They got to go 100% on fire. And then, again, usually there's something left over for range management, watershed management, recreation management, all science, all of the other stuff that the Forest Service does. And so that annual sort of budgeting process for this federal agency is called the fire borrow, right? They borrow against everything else they got to do to make sure that the roof doesn't burn off, and then get back to everything else in kind of the remaining months of the year. This year, the United States Forest Service, the director sent out a memo to be sent through all of the supervisory foresters and district foresters. Supervisory forester is the chief person in charge of one national forest. A district forester is in charge of one district on that national forest. And so a whole bunch of folks like you and me and tens of thousands of people that have worked with the Forest Service in the past all got this big memo, a lot of current employees got it, stuff like that, saying, hey, this year it's going to be a big year for the fire borrow. We are not going to hire any 1039s for anything else. That's it. And that's kind of horrible, if you want to do anything other than fire and you really want to work with the Forest Service. And you might want to in a forestry major, right? It makes sense. So that's something to kind of understand, right? That's just the dynamic of the Forest Service. They are the sort of banner carrier on leading the effort to fight wildfires. And it's an interagency effort, like everybody, state and federal, works on fire. It's just generally the Forest Service as an organization that handles the forest fires before everything else, and other organizations handle fire with everything else, right? So the Park Service, for example, they have some amazing hotshot teams, and they work and train and play pretty hard, but they're mostly focused on preservation, not on landscape fire management and so forth. So all this to say, the Park Service has its quirks. They don't have a fire borrow every year like the Forest Service does. Bureau of Land Management doesn't do things quite like the Park Service does. In fact, they're really pretty different, even though they're in the same department of the federal government. So in understanding that all of these are at the same level, they're on an equal playing field at the top level of federal land management, and have some of the highest quality, best trained people anywhere in the world. Truly, like, we send teams of people out all over the world to help other countries with their land management as well. And that's a lot of fun as a forester, to go help somebody in Panama or in Lithuania or Ireland or anywhere, Australia. We sent, a couple of thousand wildland firefighters to Australia in 2019 or whenever that was, when they had those crazy fires, and so forth. Like, it's a really cool way to help out all of humanity, not just put food on your table for dinner as a forester. But you gotta understand that each one of these has a distinct mission, and they have that distinct culture, and they have those distinct, budget quirks, like the fire borrow. Now, a budget quirk that stops 40,000 people getting hired, on 1039s over the course of a year, that's more than a quirk, right? I'm kind of softballing it, but every one of these organizations has their thing. The United States National Park Service, for example, from a hiring perspective, National Park Service lands aren't nearly as big typically as the national forests, right next to them. Again, that greater Yellowstone ecosystem is going to be kind of the square on the map of Yellowstone National Park, and then a whole bunch of national forests, Grand Teton National Park down here, a whole bunch of national forests and national grasslands kind of all around that. So there's one or a couple of national parks and a whole bunch of other agencies working right in that physical space. Okay? So the National Park Service typically is hiring fewer people. And they tend to be a much wider diversity of majors and backgrounds and so forth. So there are a lot of park rangers out there that are history majors or philosophy majors and stuff like that. And that kind of makes sense a little bit more of the Park Service's mission of going pretty hard on things like environmental and historic interpretation, where the Forest Service, they do a little bit of public communication like in the visitor centers and stuff like that, but they're not really primarily in the business of leading cave tours in Mammoth Cave like the National Park Service is, leading guided hikes and putting in interpretive trails and science education trails that educate their visitors quite a lot and intensively. The Park Service spent millions and millions of dollars in like 2 years renovating and upgrading and expanding just the visitor center at Mammoth Cave National Park. And it's amazing. You guys ever grow up watching the old show Dirty Jobs with Mike Rowe? The National Park Service has a movie narrated by Mike Rowe in the Mammoth Cave Visitor Center, and that like deep narrator voice that he's got. Like, it's nice, you know, they really churched it up. And before that visitor center was like half the size, maybe less, of what it is in terms of the publicly accessible space there. So it's this huge, huge focus that's really pretty different than what the Forest Service is even trying to do. And that's fine, right? So the Forest Service does recreation management, but it's only one of 6 or 7 things that are their number one priority equally across all of those 6 or 7. The Park Service has 2 top priorities: visitor experience, resource protection. That's it. Okay? So let's talk a little bit more about some of the ins and outs of some of these organizations. Primarily, I'm interested in not just like winning trivia night, knowing this stuff, but more like helping you guys and gals calibrate your sense of, okay, I really want to work with the Forest Service, but the fire borrow is going to eat up all of my 1039 opportunities in the next 12 months. So what's another organization where I could do exactly all of the same stuff, like literally the same key phrases on the job posting for an Army Corps of Engineers thing at Rend Lake, just up the road, versus doing watershed management on the Shawnee National Forest as a forestry technician, that kind of a thing. Okay? So let's go through a bunch of these and kind of just start picking and choosing which of these kind of fits with your temperament, fits with your interests and stuff like that. Whether or not you want to go into forest rec management, obviously you're not doing this to impress me or get a good grade or anything. It's just more a sense of, okay, what kind of fits right with my vibe, all right? And so forth. So that you can be flexible when the fire borrow basically shuts down Forest Service hiring across the entire system for a given year. You can flip over to any of these other ones and do the exact same stuff and be perfectly fine, right? And still accumulating that federal experience if you want to go the federal route, right? You can go anywhere with the federal land management agencies and so forth. All right, so Bureau of Land Management, they are out west. They manage a huge amount of what in the mid-1800s would have been considered desolate, useless, barren, unproductive land. So BLM manages 262, a quarter of a billion acres. That's a huge chunk of the entire western United States. It's double digits among our top 4 here. And it's all the land that's too rocky. It's too dry. It's too high elevation. It's too fill in the blank to run cheap beef like cattle operations, or certainly things like water-intensive agriculture farming operations out west. Now these days, now that we have robust highways and off-road vehicles and energy dense fossil fuels, or these days battery technologies and charging stations and so forth, you can get out there and you can do a whole bunch of stuff. So BLM manages places like all around national parks. For example, we talked about petrified forests around the Holy Guacamole Trail at Zion National Park. And you can kind of just go and do your thing. So in 2019, when we were rolling on summer camp out west, we got 6 inches of snow at the Grand Canyon at the end of May and the first couple days of June, because south rim of the Grand Canyon is 1.5 miles up in the air, right? It's high elevation plateau at both rims of the Grand Canyon. The north rim is 2,000 feet higher than that. At 75 or 8,000 feet. And it's just cold up top. It was hot and balmy down in the canyon, but there could be a 70-degree temperature range from the bottom to the top just based on the elevational difference in air pressure, which is why the deepest mines in the world are too hot for humans to survive in. So BLM, like these days, you can take your Jeep across a lot of these places, and you can roll your RV, if it's a high clearance RV, out to a bunch of these spots and just chill. And you will probably never see a BLM person, like a ranger, for example, field staff in any case, much at all, because BLM has a lot of land to manage, more than anybody else. They have a relatively very small staff, so they do a lot of interagency dispatch and coordination with other agencies nearby, like Forest Service and Park Service primarily, and state. And you can kind of do your own thing. So in 2017, we were out west and camping on BLM land, and a BLM ranger, law enforcement ranger, Elio, came rolling in pretty hot to our campsite. High travel, shocks bouncing pretty hard as he's rolling it hot on us, and jumps out of his truck, and I'm like, oh shit, who didn't hide their weed well enough or whatever. And he's like, hey guys, I'm Greg, I'm a Saluki alum, and I work for BLM. How you guys doing? It's good to see you. And I was like, I need to go change my pants, but we're doing great. We're doing great now. So Greg ended up hanging out with us that evening for dinner, and he was like, hey, I wanted to catch you guys yesterday, but I had to go drive into Moab on interagency dispatch. There were a bunch of guys driving their old Ford Broncos, like a 1980s Ford Bronco, that they'd taken a Sawzall to and cut the roof off of to turn it into a convertible, permanent convertible. And they were brandishing AK-47s, just like hooting and hollering, not like domestic terrorists, more like drunken good old boys, They were just driving into town to gas up their gas hog and go back out into the BLM land and, dual wield their modified AK-47 automatics, like arms akimbo or whatever. And that's kind of a day in the life of a BLM ranger, right? Greg explained that he was individually in charge of a chunk of the map that was basically a this is so dumb, a 100 by 100 mile square on the map between Canyonlands National Park and Moab and Arches National Park. Now, I'm no college professor, but I can do multiplication, and that's 10,000 square miles that Greg is individually responsible for, which is awesome. Like, he pretty much kind of sets his day with like, well, I should probably go check over this area over here. I haven't been over there in a couple of weeks. Let's see what's going on over there. Or gets a call from interagency dispatch. Hey, there are people, brandishing machine guns in town. Could you go maybe talk them down? They're kind of freaking people out. like it's weird and uncomfortable, and so on and so forth. So BLM is a very sort of, in my opinion, underappreciated, underloved organization. They get a lot done with a few very self-reliant and self-starter oriented people who also have to be very good at working on teams across agencies, right? So that interagency dispatch about the AK-47s and so forth, that was Federal Park Service, because Arches, LEOs are very close to Moab. He happened to be close to Moab at the time. The Manti-La Sal National Forest is kind of just east and south of Moab in that area, and so there were forest protection officers rolling hot onto that gas station as well. Because you just don't know until you rock up on that and, talk to these guys and be like, hey, maybe open container laws and automatic weapons, it could be strictly legal if you're out there and nobody knows about it, but maybe not in town, So that's kind of what the vibe can be like with Bureau of Land Management. They also do a bunch of rangeland management. This would be a rangeland that is like pretty marginal at best, suitable for very low density, high rotation grazing operations, where for, $100 or whatever, your family's ranching operation can lease, 100,000 acres of this pretty marginal dry grassland around the edges of these big open rocky areas out west, and just run cattle across it and so forth. So they do a lot of that kind of thing as well. Forest Service, obviously, we know a lot about the Forest Service, so I'm actually not going to talk a whole lot about them. We do a ton of stuff, and Forest Service is, man, they are hard pressed right now on hiring. But the main thing to remember with applying to Forest Service, because it's such a multiple use organization, a multiple use sustained yield act mandate that it gave the Forest Service, is that if you're hired on as a forestry technician, you gotta read the actual fine print on that job listing. It'll be like about a page worth of paragraphs of the job title just says forestry technician, but here's what you're actually going to be doing. You're going to be helping so-and-so with efforts to electrofish, catch and tag native and non-native invasive species on this particular watershed. So strap a car battery to your back, jam the electrodes in the water. Hopefully you're in non-conductive hip waders, and you just shock them until they flop into the net, check them out, and then release them or whatever. And they do rangeland management and fire and water, like all of the things. So if you're a forestry technician, you could be doing mostly wildlife stuff. If you're a recreation technician, you could be doing mostly rangeland stuff. You gotta read the actual job thing. Don't search on job titles. Search on the responsibilities that you want to do and the skills that you want to use. Those are all listed in there. And then if you're really interested in the position, pick up that ancient torture device, the phone, and call the person listed as the contact for that job listing and ask them, what are the specifics of these responsibilities? What are we actually going to be hired to do? Because those job listings are copy pasted for up to a few thousand people getting hired across like multiple entire national forests, and they're not all going to be doing exactly the same thing at each one of those, right? So you want to get in contact with the actual person at the actual forest where the hiring event is focused on, and just ask them, hey, what is this specific posting for this particular national forest district? What's it all about? I'm interested in this. I'd like to learn more. They'd be delighted to have a conversation with you because they are foresters and they want to talk forestry. So you don't have to be intimidated by that at all. Fish and Wildlife, they do a whole lot of conservation and a whole lot of zoology and wildlife science. So all of this is mediated through habitat management. So if you are, coming in from the zoology program side of things or the wildlife biology side of things, right? It all comes down ultimately to habitat. So we can't do wildlife veterinary stuff for all of the billions of organisms that Fish and Wildlife Service is trying to keep alive. We can do large-scale and small-scale habitat management to set up those organisms for success and vibrant population dynamics and so forth. Okay? Cool. National Park Service, the smallest among the landowners, but definitely the most visible among them, right? I mean, it's only 3.7% of the land base. Now, that's grown a little bit since then, but not by much. So, yeah, let's get into it. All right. Bureau of Land Management. Mission: to sustain the health, diversity, and productivity of the public lands for the use and enjoyment of present and future generations. So this is the last of the last stuff. This is what they couldn't give away to settlers, was the tagline that we used last week. Everybody is trending upward in recreation visits, so that's going to be sort of the easy way to file those numbers. You guys are not on the hook to memorize dates or specific figures. I'm more interested in looking at trends. Okay? Where's the growth happening? Like, where's the exciting action across these different federal agencies? Okay? So, BLM land, we're not real familiar with it here in Illinois because it's basically all west of the Mississippi and pretty well west of the Front Range of the Rockies as well beyond that. Everything east of the Front Range of the Rockies is well watered enough to be either the breadbasket of the world, the Mississippi Valley, or the Missouri Valley, the Ohio River Valley, in which we are as well. Or it's east of the Mississippi, and it's been settled for, 200, 300, 400 years, and there's just not a lot of space left over for an agency like BLM to get the last things left out of these old land purchases, like the Louisiana Purchase, the Gadsden Purchase, buying California from Spain, stuff like that, and so forth. Okay, so here's a map of BLM lands. A huge chunk of Nevada, substantial portions of Utah, big chunks of Wyoming. So when you see BLM in Colorado and Wyoming, or if you see United States Forest Service land, particularly the range land that the United States Forest Service manages in Colorado or Wyoming, I want you to think elk hunting. Elk are huge migratory animals. They need lots and lots and lots of habitat. And the range for a non-habituated elk to start fleeing from humans, if it's aware of humans nearby, is 1 mile. So you need enormous chunks of land to get after this. Make sense? All right. So this is kind of what BLM land does. And again, it's with a relatively small staffed force. So you're highly mobile. You are a low density presence on the land as a BLM functional. You are maybe up in the north sections or the central sections of Alaska. That is a different life. But if you are willing to hire out on any federal position up to Alaska, for even just the short summer season. So in southern central Alaska, for example, the summer season, the last killing frost is in mid-May, and the first killing frost is in mid or early August. So it's like fall colors, August 3rd, 4th, 5th, something like that, up there. Think about it. If you are willing to move out, you can move up very quickly in any of these organizations. Because a lot of people want to stay real close to home, which is valid, and it makes a lot of sense. But it makes it very hard to fill spots in BLM and Forest Service and Park Service in places like anywhere in Alaska or in Hawaii, which is bizarrely hard to hire on because there are a bunch of laws on the books that make it easier to hire native Hawaiians who are on site already. And if you're just parachuting in from the mainland to work at temp seasonal down in Hawaii, everything there is like 2, 3, 4, 5 times more expensive, right? And that's just kind of a consequence of living out way off in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, a couple of 1,000 miles from anywhere else. But all that to say, that's an opportunity for you. Most folks who are applying to work with these organizations, they're applying to the Park Service, not getting in, and then throwing up their hands and being like, well, I tried. Okay? But you guys and gals, if you want to do forestry stuff, apply to work with BLM and Forest Service and Park Service and United States Army Corps of Engineers, etc., all down the line, Fish and Wildlife Service, and you can be doing this stuff and just wearing a different agency emblem or service emblem than what everybody would kind of stereotypically think or guess. And from there, you got your career launched and you can kind of bounce around wherever you want. Okay? So, BLM land tends to look like this, Red Rocks country. So this is a picture from Utah. Okay? Picture from, this would be like northern Arizona or southern Utah. Mesa country, tableland country, canyon country. A lot of that is Utah, Nevada, northern Arizona, stuff like that. Okay? So, it's a lot of fun. You can kind of do anything you want on BLM land, and it's bad that I'm recording that, but it's also kind of true by default, because one agent for 10,000 square miles, right? If you do something, you're kind of on your own to do it. So when we go and camp on BLM land out west for summer camp, stuff like that, there will be all kinds of stuff. People just leaving geocaches out there. If you're familiar with what a geocache is, it's like a GPS-powered scavenger hunt, enabled with online clues and stuff like that. There's lots of brass and shell casings all over the place on BLM land, because you can just drive along on your four-wheeler, like dual-wielding AK-47s, and like, yeah, like you're not gonna hit anybody. There's nobody else out there. Granted, that's still super irresponsible to not know your target and what is behind it, but some people experience that way. Forest Service is a big and functional apparatus for actual land management on the United States territorial lands all over the place, and in a whole bunch of international efforts. All right, so national forests we're all familiar with. Again, the Forest Service is in charge of big national grasslands. So in places like Kansas, for example, the United States Forest Service, where there's not a whole lot of forest at all anywhere in Kansas, the Forest Service still has an enormous presence because those national grasslands are a really big deal. Okay? And most importantly, the research and experimental forests that they run are tremendously, irreplaceably valuable for you and me as foresters trying to figure out how to get stuff done. So just east of us at Land Between the Lakes National Recreation Area, which on the label, it's a national recreation area, so it sounds like it should be run by the National Park Service. It was not. It was an area created by the Tennessee Valley Authority, a water project management group, right? The federal government during the Great Depression. They dammed up the Kentucky and Tennessee rivers and created essentially a long peninsula between them. That is Land Between the Lakes. And the Tennessee Valley Authority handed that area off to not the National Park Service because it's not an outstanding, unique, ecological, geologic, geographic situation. It was created by a couple of big dams. And now the sport fishing on those lakes is amazing. The national recreation area that the United States Forest Service turned Land Between the Lakes into is absolutely run as a gigantic experiment. So it's a spot where we got Turkey Bay OHV area. And bless you. So it's like this 80-mile long peninsula. We got Kentucky, Tennessee lakes, and we got this little spot, maybe right here-ish, called Turkey Bay OHV area. And Turkey Bay OHV area was set up to try and figure out, in an era where we have high horsepower, lightweight, so you could call these torque to weight ratio miracles of modern engineering. And in a time where enthusiasts of off-roading can rig up their welder, hook it off to a car battery or truck battery, and weld rebar spikes onto their rims after they pull the tires off, and go wall crawling, spidering up literal cliffs, and just chip shredding or gyro tracking those cliffs down into nothing. How do we manage the land for OHV use as a federal agency? Well, land between the lakes, it's not a pristine national park-like setting. It's a bunch of old farmland, and it's now completely sort of controlled and run by the United States Forest Service. So they said, all right, let's set aside this huge chunk of this area that's been kind of captive to the federal government and stuff like that. Let's have a whole bunch of OHV folks here, and we'll try some different policies. Like, do we want a whole bunch of trails real close to each other? Do we want like one long snaky trail going through? Let's just play around with this and see what happens. And that way we don't have to play around with it and see what happens at all of the other places where people want to go off-roading, four-wheeling, wall crawling, and mudding and stuff like that across the entire set of national forests, national grasslands, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We can do some crazy intensive moonshot kind of experiments on hunting, on fishing, on OHV stuff, on wildland fire management in combination with hunting and stuff like that in this place. So this entire 80-mile long peninsula is a huge experiment. Like, hey, I got this dumb idea. Let's see what happens when we put it into place as the United States Forest Service. And then our visitors can tell us pretty quick, hey, this is awesome, this is amazing. We're gonna full send this. Versus, this was a terrible idea and I'm rethinking my entire life, right? We can use that network of research and experimental forests to do this stuff. And this is really, really, really important that we do this in this way. The United States National Park Service also does a bunch of science and research, but it's all geared towards preservation. So the National Park Service is never, ever going to be able to or interested in screwing around with OHV and its highly destructive potential for altering the face of the land. All right? So, in this way, there's a whole lot of real high quality hunting here. There's a whole lot of not just wildland fire management on this peninsula. This place is just amazing. And we'll try and get you there for summer camp if you haven't already been. It's fantastic. And then we can take everything we learn here and spread it out to over 150 other national forests and see good things happen and not have to blunder through a bunch of dead ends at 155 national forests. Make sense? All right, so if you like solving hard problems, if you like tackling things that make a big difference and affect hundreds of millions of people directly and indirectly, then think about working with the Forest Service at a place like Land Between the Lakes. It's not far from here, right? If you're trying to stay home or close to family and stuff like that, just a couple hours away. And we got a ton of really cool stuff done at those research and experimental forests. Shawnee National Forest is not an experimental forest in the same way. So a lot of the people who are trained up at Land Between the Lakes or are using the research that was generated at Land Between the Lakes go ahead and apply that at the Shawnee, recontextualizing it for the ecological differences between Land Between the Lakes in northern central Kentucky and here in southern Illinois on the Shawnee, right? Different soil type in some ways, slightly different mix of species and stuff like that. So we can't just like rubber stamp, copy paste stuff, but we can do some intelligent modifications of the insights we get off of those experimental forests and move forward with those. 205 million recreation visits 20 years ago. And again, all of these organizations are growing rapidly in their human visitation. So these research and experimental forests are also sites of government experimentation on humans, but it's totally ethical, cool, above board stuff, not the weird Nazi shit from 70 years ago, okay? If you ever want to talk about like bizarre Nazi experiments, I teach a graduate class on the ethics of research, and there's so many stories. Binders full of stories out of the Nazis. They're just terrible, and they're impressively terrible stories. Anyway, all right, so the United States Forest Service is going to have, surprisingly, the largest developed campgrounds on any federal lands at places like Land Between the Lakes National Recreation Area. National Recreation Area is meant to be used as intensively and completely and efficiently as possible for recreation primarily. So there are logging and timber extraction operations on Land Between the Lakes National Recreation Area run by the Forest Service. But the main focus is in getting as many people through that or those gates and out onto the water fishing, out in their OHVs, out on horses. There's like 100 miles of really nice horse trails over there, and so forth and so on. And then the Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management both have a very permissive, as much as they can be permissive about this stuff, primitive camping policy across most all of these BLM units and national forests and grasslands and so forth. So if you ever want to go on a trip just like out west with your friends and stuff like that, plan stops at national parks, plan your stays for the national forests next to each of those national parks where you can just go for free. And you can be there, typically it's dry camping, so there's no like bathrooms or water or anything like that, but you can just get those things during the day at the national park. And you don't have to deal with tens of thousands of other people packed in right next to you at these enormous campgrounds, like at Grand Canyon National Park, where we have, say, the Grand Canyon here and the Colorado River running through it, and the Kaibab and Coconino National Forests outside of that. You can camp if you want to be surrounded by a press of humanity at South Rim Village in the Grand Canyon, or you can camp on the national forests outside of that and have a whole bunch of forest land to yourself and the elk wandering through your camp in either case. Okay? So the primitive camping, the low standard, the undeveloped camping opportunities off the Forest Service land are typically right off the edge of the forest road cutting through that particular district on the forest. With the Park Service, it's got to be in a campground or typically at a designated campsite, and you got to get a permit and a reservation. I'll start making reservations for summer camp coming up here in October for the following summer. Right, it's a big lift to try and get into a national park these days, especially with a bigger group like ours, and so forth. Here with the Forest Service, there's the sense of we can manage camping to that level. I mean, clearly the Park Service does, and they do a great job with it, but we could also just kind of take a step back, unclench a little bit, not like white knuckle the process real hard with kind of a death grip. Instead, we'll just kind of be okay with people as long as they're not totally trashing it. And, you know, we'll send presence patrols out there to make sure everything's okay every once in a while. But you can just turn down an unmarked forest road on a national forest and look for a wide spot next to the road and throw your tent down and just kind of exist for 2 weeks, you know? You don't have to be in the system. You don't have to have the permit. You don't have to do everything. And the BLM is kind of that to the nth degree as well, okay? So to give you a sense of how the United States National Forest System arrived, right, we have more and more and more of these over time, and these days, this is the overall map of the United States National Forest System with a few smaller national forests marked, kind of hard to see with this dark brown. But notice how the forests are couched around those national parks. Make sense? All right. These days, national forests are managed as complexes. So here east of the Mississippi, right, we're here in southern Illinois, east of us is first the Daniel Boone National Forest, Red River Gorge, Clifty Falls Wilderness Areas, places like that in eastern central Kentucky, running down to Tennessee. And then east of that, along the Appalachian Ridge Chain, we have the George Washington, the Jefferson National Forest. Further south, we have like the Nantahala National Forest. And again, wrapped around places like Shenandoah National Park, Great Smoky Mountains National Park, but quite a bit more area given over to national forest management than national park management. Okay? And a lot of these forests in the east here, especially along the Appalachians, are fairly close to major metropolitan areas, so they can get very, very busy. Here in the Shawnee, it's a pretty busy day if we see anybody else at Inspiration Point, overlooking the Mississippi River. There, it can be a whole other thing, right? Imagine having Philadelphia and Roanoke and Washington, D.C., and Gettysburg, and a whole bunch of other places within about a half day's drive of your national forest, right? So something like 100 million people in round numbers. That's a lot of people who, if they get the idea, even if a fraction of a percent of the people get the idea to visit your national forest that day, that's still a lot of people, right? So they can be kind of a busy vibe out east. Out west, right? We got the national forests all along the Sierra Mountains, Sierra Nevadas of California and Western Nevada and stuff like that. And just, my gosh, there is so much fire management on everything out west. It's fires all the way down. All right, Fish and Wildlife Service. 545 units. That is more than the Park Service. 96 million acres. Also more than the Park Service. And there is at least one national wildlife refuge in each state. There is not a national park in each state. Now, there are national park units in almost every state, but not national parks. Okay, so national battlefields, wild and scenic rivers count as national park units, but not national parks. Okay. Now, they get a lot less recreation than some of these other orgs. And we'll end on this idea. If the Park Service is getting 300 million visits a year, and Fish and Wildlife is trying to top 45 million visits a year, if you like working on forests, if you like working with fuzzy animals, or their habitats more specifically, but you don't like dealing with people, think about Fish and Wildlife. All right, we're over time. We'll end there. I'm around for questions if you have them. Otherwise, I'll see you on Thursday. We'll keep on churning through agencies and organizations, getting down to where it really matters, the local stuff.
I have a document, so I'm not going to meetings.
See that?
So I missed last class. What did you cover last class?
More of this stuff, so kind of the introduction to this section of it. I'm pretty sure I got that recorded, so I'll upload it to YouTube and stuff like that, and it'll be available for you.
All right.
Cool.
I can act.